Hello and welcome to Sport Unlocked, the podcast guiding you through the sports news beyond the pitch. And it's a week that ends with an order from the IOC, don't stage your events in Russia. It's a week that ends with landmarks including Wembley Stadium here in London lit in the blue and yellow of Ukraine. It's the week when sport was forced to confront its embrace of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president who ordered the invasion of Ukraine and whose isolation by so many countries has already seen events taken off Russia from the Champions League final to the Formula One. I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, and alongside me as ever are Tarek Pandya from the New York Times and Martin Ziegler from the Times for an episode where we begin, quite incredibly, reflecting on a war in Europe.
Yeah, it's what a terrible week it is for the world. Basically, I think we should probably say that to start off with. But yeah, in terms of sport, it's St. Petersburg was due to host it May the 28th. That has obviously become fairly swiftly became untenable, and UEFA facing a difficult decision in terms of its with one of its major sponsors being Gazprom, but there's no alternative, was there, Tarek?
No, and it shouldn't have come to this at this point because a lot of these sports bodies, UEFA, the IOC, FIFA as well, people would argue they've enabled bad Russian behaviour. Let's not forget this is a total invasion of Ukraine that's taking place, but the Russians have invaded Ukraine for several years. For example, in the Donbass Valley and Luhansk, and the tournaments and events were still being awarded, like this Champions League final that was given to St. Petersburg and is now going to be removed. It just shows how intertwined, I guess, Russia is with the world's sports movements.
So there was a lot of speculation about where the final might move to, London obviously being floated as so often, but in the end, it was talks between the UEFA president and French officials. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, involved in the decision. That took the game to Paris instead.
Yeah, I think some of the noises out of Britain were one of the reasons why it's not in London. There's logistical issues, of course, but also I think there's a sense that certain British politicians were using football for their own end, using this conflict for their own end, and it doesn't always have to be in London. Do you think it's interesting that it was Macron, because he's been the European politician that has kind of appeared front and centre in the European Union's response to Putin and Russia?
And what this tells us is actually there is a significant interest in how sport is used as prestige, despite the fact Macron and the European Commission were heavily involved in the hours after the invasion in dealing with the far graver security situation. They recognise there is a prestige still that Russia was gaining by having these sports events still. And I think that's why Macron was getting involved, to ensure that it wasn't necessarily going to be in Russia. Of course, a French team, Paris Saint-Germain, could be playing in it as well. And Paris stepped in. The Stade de France will host the game, and they've not had the final since 2006. So, they have waited their time. And I think something significant as well that came out of that UEFA Executive Committee meeting was them saying that they're going to be working to actually help to get players out of Ukraine, because we have to remember there are actually people in danger. There will be footballers, many other athletes still in the country.
Quite right. From what I understand, there's certainly a large number from the Shakhtar Donetsk football team that have been reaching out, asking for help to get out of Ukraine. Of course, at this point, we're recording, men of fighting age have been told to remain in the country. It's an unprecedented situation. Again, you kind of remember the situation in Afghanistan where sport was required to pull people out of a war zone, essentially.
It was 8 years ago around this week that, of course, Russia started to annex Crimea. It had the separatists it back going into the east, into Donetsk. And I then went to Sochi for the Winter Paralympics, which were still taking place just a couple of 100 miles from Crimea on Russian soil, with Ukrainian athletes there at a time when Putin was actually denying any involvement with the encroachments into Ukrainian territory. Obviously, that was soon clear enough. And yet, since then, despite the condemnation, despite the shooting down of MH17 over Ukraine, full of many Dutch citizens, events kept on being awarded to Russia, as you say. And also, the world went to Russia in 2018 for the World Cup, not just to celebrate sport, but also to celebrate Vladimir Putin as well. And, very much the messaging from FIFA was to thank and be celebratory towards Putin.
Yeah, there's lots of pictures, aren't there, of various people from the world of football, shaking Putin's hand, being pictured with him. I mean, absolutely, sport has cozied up to him despite everything. The doping scandal, all the sort of military issues, and attacks on English soil about people being killed in Britain. It's by the poisonings. It's everywhere you look, you see people buttering him up.
Yeah, from a sports perspective, guys, let's not forget that enormous doping scandal that rocked all of sport, and a lot of people say they were not punished for that. Just earlier this month, an entire Russian squad, more than 200 athletes, were in Beijing for the Winter Olympics, an Olympics where Russia ostensibly were banned. It just seems sport is incapable of taking any action against Russia. Our enablers, like other parts of the economy, and look where we've got to.
And we're seeing an unprecedented statement in terms of the International Olympic Committee saying that sports federations should move their events out of Russia, and also Belarus, which has been used as a staging ground for the attack on behalf of Russia into Ukraine. It's a really significant statement, given how they haven't been that condemnatory at times over the state-sponsored doping scheme that corrupted sports so significantly, the IOC.
Yeah, the IOC have gone softly for 8 years, really, when it comes to Russia. We've talked about it before. Russia were involved in one of the biggest scandals in sports history with that doping. And a lot of people say they hadn't really been punished. They were, of course, in Beijing for the Olympics, more than 200 athletes, despite being banned. I think it's taken invading a neighbouring country, declaring war for sport to take a stand, it seems.
And that breach of the Olympic truce, something that's been highlighted. It runs through to the end of the Paralympics. The Paralympics do start next week in Beijing, and the IPC are working on ensuring the safety of athletes getting there. And obviously it's highly charged games, just as it was in 2014 in Sochi, when I was actually out there for it, just straight after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And we talk about the invasion now. The invasion started in 2014. This isn't anything new at all. Sochi, of course, normally hosts the Russian Grand Prix, but that has already been cancelled, and it was due to be staged in September. F1 saying it'd be impossible to stage the race there.
Yeah, the F1 statement, Rob, does leave a bit of a wriggle room. That race, like you say, September, that's 7 months away. The F1 kind of said, as it stands right now, today, there's not going to be a Formula One race in Russia. And of course, there won't be one today. So it seems that they're in a bit of a holding pattern. What will be interesting to see is if hostilities do cease, what the reaction to Russia will be after that. Russia have engaged in this barbarous act in Ukraine. Even if they pull back from the brink, will the world be as forgiving of them as they have been in recent years?
Does Russia just get normalised? And maybe that's why when I asked the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino, whether he'd be handing back an honour he got from Vladimir Putin, he was very non-committal. Well, dodge the question. This is what happened on his Zoom press conference.
Will you be retaining your Order of Friendship Medal that you received from Vladimir Putin after the 2018 World Cup? And in light of all the developments that have happened now, do you have any regrets about the 2018 World Cup, your glowing endorsements of Vladimir Putin and his conduct? Because they had already annexed Crimea at that point in 2014, and there have been concerns raised, particularly in the British government, that sport does help to legitimise the actions of a country like Russia when it acts aggressively towards a neighbour. So will you be reflecting on perhaps the role of sport and how it can help to embolden a leader like Vladimir Putin in taking action, as it has done aggressively in Ukraine?
Thanks, Rob. We are constantly reflecting on the role of sport, in particular the role of sport in trying to bring people together in a peaceful environment, even people, countries who don't have relations with each other or who are in a conflict with each other. This is a constant in our thinking, and I firmly believe in sport to bring people together. Football is the people's sport as well. It's not about individuals, it's about all the people from all over the world. And honestly, today, right today, if we had this press conference yesterday, maybe I would say something else, I don't know, but today my thoughts are really on all the people who are affected by this escalating conflict and nothing else.
Well, that was Gianni Infantino speaking after the FIFA Council meeting, and it's good at least he did do a press conference, so we had the chance to pose those questions, but it's his uncomfortable relationship with Vladimir Putin from the World Cup in 2018, since then even at the recent Beach World Cup, that is so much more under scrutiny now, and just how he aligned himself so closely, but also lavishing so much praise on him at times as a person.
And it's not just Vladimir Putin that he's allied himself to. He likes strongman leaders, as Donald Trump and, of course, Mohammed bin Salman. You know, my mind goes immediately to the opening game of the 2018 World Cup in Russia, Rob. Saudi Arabia versus Russia in Moscow. Gianni Infantino felt at times he was being used as a coffee table, sat there in between Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman. It wasn't a good look, and here we are today.
I think, you know, we encounter this a lot as we talk about Olympic Games, we talk about World Cups in countries, about people trying to say sporting events will change countries and the world has got them wrong. So it was a message we kept on hearing during the 2018 World Cup saying, look, this shows how friendly Russia is. This is a welcoming country to the world. This isn't how the media have portrayed it. And this was being perpetuated the whole time. Yet, certainly something I would try to emphasize there was just because a population within certain regions can be welcoming and not abusive effectively towards welcoming football fans, that's not an endorsement of the Russian state and of the regime. And the World Cup has left no legacy in terms of transforming the behaviour of Vladimir Putin, has it? You know, and during the tournament, it was particularly striking that Infantino made it very much not just about a celebration, appreciation of Russia, but of Vladimir Putin. And he said, we are on the same team. This was 2018 when we'd had years of Russia causing chaos, meddling in elections, accusations, and various other nefarious activities. And something I put to Gianni Infantino at the closing press conference in Russia.
Before the World Cup, when you met Vladimir Putin, you said you were on the same team. Last week ago at the Kremlin, you said that the world has fallen in love with Russia. Do you think you would find agreement from the victims, the families of MH17, from those who see themselves as being annexed by Ukraine, those who've been on the receiving end of election interference, those athletes who've been cheated by a state-sponsored doping program? You also have Human Rights Watch who say that FIFA has allowed the World Cup to use to gloss over staggering repressions in Chechnya. In your leadership of FIFA, just where do you draw the moral red lines to prevent FIFA potentially being dragged into political issues or giving cover or endorsing countries that some entities or some groups might have issues with?
You know, Rob, I think there are many injustices in the world, generally. There are many things that in the world are not working as citizens of the world would like that they work. There are many things that we would like to change in the world. There are many things that we are not happy that happen in the world. Not in one country, not in one region, not in one area, but in the entire world. And of course we have all to try to work, to do, to speak, to make things change for the good, wherever we can. But here we are at the World Cup. We are focusing on football. We are focusing on celebrating football. And actually I think that one of the things that we are missing in the world more and more is the capacity to speak to each other, to have a dialogue. And I think that's the basis to solve some of these issues.
It's interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the sort of sports people's, you know, what they're sort of taking a moral position on Russia, which I think a lot of the time, you know, UEFA's decision has sort of made that that they don't have to do that now. And I think it is right that the competition organizer steps in.
Yeah, and Martin, you mentioned it last week or the week before about the World Cup bid for 2018, how when FIFA was investigating whether that corrupt process was indeed corrupt, Russia said, sorry, we can't help you because all our computers were on lease and the hard disks have subsequently been destroyed. And I remember, Rob, guys, we were there in Zurich the day Sepp Blatter opened the envelope. Vladimir Putin played the consummate strong man. He was in the air almost knowing that the Russians had won and landed in Zurich to give an extraordinary press conference that day.
And in it, I asked Vladimir Putin how he would be tackling racism in Russian football before the World Cup. You challenged Putin on the WikiLeaks documents which reference Russia being a mafia state. Let's take a listen to that day in December 2010 in Zurich.
Mr. Putin, congratulations on Russia's victory today. Did you feel yesterday and the day before there was these WikiLeaks allegations about Russia and the way Russia is governed today? Did you think that may damage Russia's chance of winning the vote? The Western press is running quite a lot of stories and allegations about Russia at the moment.
You know, for me, this is a totally new information. I haven't heard for a single time, in spite of numerous scandals associated with preparation for this voting, I haven't heard any condemnations or any hints of condemnations about Russia. I have never heard anything about it.
You're brave man there, Tarek, weren't you?
Turns out maybe prescient might be the word, sadly, there, Steeks.
Yeah, I think. I mean, if you look at as we're talking about his influence in sport, I mean, just something which will sort of illustrate just how important he was. For example, Pat Hickey, the sort of disgraced head of the Irish Olympic Committee. He was also like the head of the European Olympic Committee, and he loved sort of saying how much he liked Vladimir Putin. And when he was imprisoned in Rio after being arrested for ticket touting. He said afterwards that Vladimir Putin had intervened to help him get released from jail.
Extraordinary reach there, guys. There's other issues as well at play here. Most immediately, the day Russia entered Ukraine in this way that it has, Zenit St. Petersburg were playing in a Europa Cup game. There's going to be all of that to unravel. And Rob, there's a World Cup qualifier around the corner as well.
Yeah, Poland due to go to Moscow to play Russia in the semi-finals of the playoffs in March. It does help the fact perhaps it's one leg, so there isn't a home and away leg to deal with, but Russia were meant to have home advantage, so potentially that could get moved to another venue. Certainly the Poles do want some action from FIFA in terms of addressing that venue.
You're going to have a situation now where UEFA are not going to have any of their competition matches in Ukraine or Russia. It's a bit trickier for FIFA, isn't it? But it'll be interesting to see what they do.
And should Russia qualify for that World Cup, of course, they, part of that doping ban, can't be called Russia in Qatar. FIFA still haven't said what the language will be, but presumably they are still subject to that World Anti-Doping Agency ban.
Well, absolutely, which is a reminder of just how Russia has attacked sport as well, the integrity of sport in recent years, led from the top, as we're told by the investigators, with Vladimir Putin, who now stands, as the British government are saying, as a pariah on the world stage. And yet there's even talk down the line of bidding for a European Championship, maybe even going for the Olympics again. But as it stands now, obviously, far weightier matters in terms of governments are having to address. But the finances of Russia, and we touched on the Gazprom sponsorship of UEFA. They've sponsored the Champions League since 2012, when Gianni Infantino, now FIFA president, was general secretary at UEFA, and the final was due to be staged in Gazprom's sponsored stadium in St. Petersburg. And a member of Gazprom's executive sits on the UEFA executive committee too.
Not just any member of the executive, Rob, the chief executive, Alexander Zhukov. Now, he is invited, or was invited, to that meeting that decided to strip St. Petersburg of the final, if he was there, which I'm not sure of at this point, that would have made for a very awkward conversation. But one thing is clear, right, guys? Well, for me, I don't know, nothing will be the same now with regards, certainly parts of Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe, and Western European sports bodies, teams, and Russia. So there's a lot more to unspool here, presumably. Russian money in English football, for example, Martin. What does that mean?
Yeah, just to go back to the Gazprom thing briefly. I mean, apparently, I think Gazprom, as things stand, owes UEFA quite a lot of outstanding money in the sponsorship. So it's effectively going to have to sort of put its hands up and say, you know, we're going to do without this, which is just one of those tough decisions I think you have to take.
And I was at Chelsea on Tuesday night for their Champions League game against Lille when there were the Gazprom adverts going round the boards there. But of course, that adds another dimension to this, the fact that, of course, Chelsea having their funding all from Roman Abramovich.
Yeah, so, I mean, we've had Abramovich's position raised in the House of Commons on a couple of days over the last week. Chris Brandt, the Labour MP, got hold of a Home Office document, which was leaked to him, which he then put parts of in the House of Commons, so it's sort of privileged, reportable.
Surely Mr. Abramovich should no longer be able to own a football club in this country. Surely we should be looking at seizing some of his assets, including his £152 million home.
Chris Brown.
Mr. Speaker, can we have a debate on the operation of Tier 1 visas, following on from some of the reports in The Sun and other newspapers today? Because I've got hold of a leaked document from 2019 from the Home Office, which says, in relation to Mr. Abramovich, as part of HMG's Russia strategy aimed at targeting illicit finance and malign activity, Abramovich remains of interest to HMG due to his links to the Russian state and his public association with corrupt activity and practices. An example of this is Abramovich admitting in court proceedings that he paid for political influence. Therefore, HMG is focused on ensuring individuals linked to illicit finance and malign activity are unable to base themselves in the UK and will use the relevant tools at its disposal, including immigration powers, to prevent this. That's nearly 3 years ago, and yet remarkably little has been done in relation. Surely Mr. Abramovich should no longer be able to own a football club in this country. Surely we should be looking at seizing some of his assets, including his £152 million home, and making sure that other people who've had Tier 1 visas like this are not engaged in malign activity in the UK.
Yeah, that's extraordinary stuff. But also, there were some other extraordinary revelations a few years ago in a High Court case between Roman Abramovich and his former business partner, the late billionaire Boris Berezovsky. There were some incredible details came out. Abramovich actually ended up winning the lawsuit, but it did expose how he made his money and how he retained his money. That proximity to Vladimir Putin was right there. Now, I don't know what's going to happen, but you know, the British state is and has been for years enthralled to Russian money, and it's not just Abramovich. Everton might find themselves in a pinch as well.
Yes, we had Margaret Hodge MP saying a list of other Russian-related oligarchs who she suggested should also be sanctioned, and that included Alisher Usmanov, whose company USM is a major backer of Everton. So that could also have implications for that club too. Perhaps not as clear as the ones regarding Abramovich's funding of Chelsea, but certainly something to keep a watch out for.
Yeah, Abramovich's funding of Chelsea, for to be clear, is north of £1 billion, isn't it? You know,
1.5 billion, north of 1.5 billion. Yeah,
and that stadium project was put on hold because of his visa issues, which stem from that relationship with Russia. That was from 2018. And like, if you're a Chelsea fan, Rob, you'd be worried, concerned. What would be the situation?
Well, obviously, Abramovich invested at a time when there were no barriers to it, and and so many Russians have been embraced by the British state. Just look at the owner of the London Evening Standard and the Independent, who's been ennobled, hasn't he?
Sits in the Evgeny Lebedev sits in the House of lords. Now, his father was a KGB officer. Now, I can just imagine what Vladimir Putin's response would be if the son of an MI5 operative wanted to buy a major Russian newspaper or a TV channel. I don't think he'd last a couple of minutes there.
As for Abramovich, well, he's been pretty active in the courts in London in recent years, suing in part over claims he bought Chelsea on the orders of Putin, and he secured changes to future editions of the book that is mentioned in. Abramovich hasn't had a visa for 4 years for the UK. He didn't renew it in a period when the British government was reviewing the long-term visas of wealthy Russians in the UK. It all followed the outrage over the poisoning of the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury in southwest England. They were exposed to the nerve agent Novichok. 3 months later, 2 British people were exposed to the Soviet-developed nerve agent nearby to Salisbury, and it did claim the life of Dawn Sturgis. So it's against that backdrop that we have had pretty poor British-Russian relations, and Abramovich has not sought to get a new visa, but he has managed to get Israeli citizenship, he has an Israeli passport, and he's been able to travel into the country on that in recent months in particular.
Yeah, I mean, you can get access into the UK with an Israeli passport on a short-term basis. I think the issue over his previous visa, he had an entrepreneurial visa, it was called, and that's what he didn't apply to get renewed.
I mean, I did surprisingly encounter Abramovich in November at Stamford Bridge. I was actually invited as a member of the media to there for the visit of the Israeli president, not knowing Abramovich would be there. I walk into this small room, and there he is, sort of standing at the bar with some of his associates, and he doesn't want to engage in English, but he is there, and he was seated at a small lunch that I was on the next table at, and we had the Israeli president, praising him for his investment and his support of and work against anti-Semitism. So obviously, it's very worthwhile in terms of the cause, in terms of investing in awareness about Holocaust education and against anti-Semitism.
Well, maybe, Rob, what we're wondering is that he has his influence and his wealth has allowed him to buy himself this sort of at least a veneer of respectability, and I guess also we've talked about this with countries. We talked about it with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the UAE. This word sports washing. Being an investor in sport and being allied to these really worthy charitable events does give you that air of respectability, and that's what those nations are doing.
Abramovich, though, hasn't taken the easy path in choosing to use his platform at Chelsea to raise awareness about the Holocaust and to campaign against anti-Semitism. He and Chelsea have had to call out the anti-Semitism amongst some of their own fans at Chelsea and trying to eradicate that and to educate them. So it has actually been a pretty challenging area for them. As for Abramovich, well, we do wait to see when he is back in the UK next as this crisis does unfold. And it is obviously far bigger than Chelsea, far bigger than one club, as the repercussions do spread across the world of sport, beyond obviously the humanitarian disaster that is unfolding in Ukraine.
Just on a wider level with Putin and Russia, I noticed the IOC have actually condemned Putin, the Russian government, for breaking the Olympic truce. I mean, that's, you might say that's a sort of fairly feeble thing from the IOC after sort of years of kowtowing to him, but I think it's quite significant that.
Did Putin wait until after the Olympics before launching this action? There was some suggestion that he didn't want to cause any inconvenience for Xi, his friend in China, in terms of launching this action before the closing ceremony taking place. And almost by clockwork, it was on Monday when we started to get the ratcheting up of tensions and that rambling speech by Putin staking a claim to Ukraine and saying it wasn't a real state.
Well, it may be. I mean, Putin was at the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, where Thomas Bach, the IOC president, said, "Observe your commitment to this Olympic truce, give peace a chance."
It has taken the words war in Europe, an invasion of a European country to take them to that point. I just don't think they could have done anything else. I just can't imagine. I don't know if you two, like in our lifetime, could we imagine, a war in Europe, this sort of language, this sort of day we've seen? I just don't think we could have imagined any of this.
Particularly as Tarek, both of us were in Donetsk during Euro 2012. So what, a decade ago, when we saw the Grand Shakhtar Stadium, the lavish airport that was built, the city that was being host to big football games, and now it's a war zone. In fact, it became a war zone in 2014. So, but I don't think any of us expect an era of sort of tanks rolling into another country and that sort of war taking place on our continent. Although it has been happening in some form for 8 years, it's just perhaps not been in the centre of attention.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the airport and the stadium. That years ago, they took severe damage. The team from the city, Shakhtar Donetsk, one of certainly Eastern Europe's most successful teams, one of its biggest spenders, has been playing its football for the last few years as a touring team, mainly in Kiev. And Rob, Euro 2012, we did spend a lot of time in Donetsk. It was in many ways a strange place, but it was a football tournament. It was sunny. It was good football. 5-star stadium. It's known for its coal miners. If you remember, before every match, there was that kind of, I guess, bizarre spectacle of a theatrical performance of people dressed as coal miners. I remember that. But yeah, it's just really shocking compared to where we are today, isn't it?
Yeah, and the Ukrainian league has been suspended. Shakhtar, top of that league.
I suppose Putin feels he's had his Winter Olympics, he's had his World Cup. Anything that would have been imperiled on a major basis, I think has already taken place, and maybe he thinks now, for many reasons, and I'm sure sport is amongst the least of his reasons, but it's he thinks now's the time for him to go.
It's a week since the Beijing Olympics as we're recording this thing. Let me ask you a question. If it was the week before the Beijing Olympics, how strident do you think the IOC statement would be? And I mean, genuine question.
I think it's the fact that Russia wasn't hosting it. I think it would still have been fairly strong. Obviously, if it's been taking place at the time of the actual Olympics, I don't think it would have happened, would it? But
well, of course, we've still got the Paralympics to come, starting next week in Beijing, and we could see Ukrainian and Russian athletes coming up against each other in sporting competition at a time when Ukrainians back home have been trying to defend their nation from a Russian assault, an absolute military invasion in Europe, 21st century Europe. And we've tried to, on this week's episode of Sport Unlocked, grapple with some of those very much secondary sporting implications of all this, and just how geopolitics does infect sports, and how sport is used by people like Vladimir Putin for prestige and status on the global stage over the last decade in particular. Tarek Martin, thanks for your insight in trying to navigate this quite unprecedented week in the history of 21st century Europe.
Safe week, guys, and safe week, everybody.
Absolutely echo that, and thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. If you've got any feedback, you can always message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, thank you for listening and stay safe.